The first scream came at dawn on March 14, 1952, in the delivery room of St. Catherine's Hospital in Michoacán, New Mexico. The midwife, Clara Benson, had attended over 300 births in her 40 years of service. She had seen breech deliveries, stillborns, and twins tangled in their cords. But she had never seen what emerged that morning. A child born with what appeared to be a rope burn encircling its neck. A perfect crimson ring that looked weeks old, though the infant had been alive in the womb minutes before. The mother, Sarah Mitchell, 23 years old and wife to a copper miner, wept not from joy, but from recognition. She had heard the stories. Every woman in Michoacán had heard them. But hearing and seeing are different languages of belief, and what lay in her arms now was proof written in flesh. The mark was precise. It circled the baby's throat like a necklace of bruised skin, darker at the front where a knot would rest, fading to purple at the sides. The infant boy breathed normally, his heart beat strong, but the mark remained, vivid and unexplainable, as though history itself had reached through time to brand him. Clara Benson cleaned the child in silence, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind struggled against what her eyes confirmed. She had been present at 17 births since the execution. 17 children. Every single one bore the mark. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to hear are stories history tried to bury, and you'll want to be here when the next one surfaces. Michoacán, New Mexico, sits in the high desert of the southwestern United States, a town born from copper and sustained by silence. In 1952, its population barely exceeded 4,000 souls, most of them miners, their wives, and the children they raised in company houses painted the same faded yellow. The landscape stretched flat and merciless in all directions, a geography of exposure where secrets had nowhere to hide except in the mouths of the living. The town had been founded in 1891 when the Michoacán Copper Company discovered a vein rich enough to justify a railroad spur. By the early 20th century, it had grown into a functional grid of streets named after saints and presidents, anchored by a courthouse, a company store, and the gallows that stood behind the jailhouse, a wooden structure that had seen use exactly once. That single use occurred on February 28, 1952, 14 days before Sarah Mitchell gave birth to the first marked child. The executed man's name was Daniel Alvaro Cortez, 31 years old, a Mexican immigrant who had worked the mines for 6 years before being convicted of a murder he swore he did not commit. The trial lasted 4 days. The evidence was circumstantial, but persuasive to a jury of white miners who deliberated for less than 2 hours. Cortez was accused of killing James Harwell, the mine foreman, whose body had been found in Shaft 7 with his skull fractured by a rock hammer. 3 witnesses placed Cortez near the shaft that evening. A 4th claimed to have seen him holding a hammer with blood on the steel. Cortez maintained his innocence until the moment the trapdoor opened beneath his feet. His last words, spoken in Spanish and translated later by Father Ignacio Ruiz, were recorded in the court clerk's log. "Every child born in this town will wear my death until you admit your sin." The execution was attended by 47 citizens and supervised by Sheriff Raymond Cole, who had overseen the construction of the gallows himself. The drop was clean. Cortez died within minutes, his neck broken as intended by the carefully measured rope. He was buried in the Catholic section of Michoacán Cemetery under a wooden cross that bore only his name and the year. No one thought much of his final words. Condemned men said many things. Curses were common, bargaining with God even more so. The town returned to its rhythm of shifts and Sundays, and Daniel Cortez was filed into the past where executions belong. Then Sarah Mitchell's baby was born with the mark. Within 6 hours of the birth, the hospital corridors filled with whispers that moved faster than official reports. By noon, 3 women had come to the maternity ward claiming they needed to see the Mitchell child. Clara Benson turned them away, but the damage was done. By evening, the entire town knew. St. Catherine's Hospital was a modest facility built in 1923 with funds from the Michoacán Copper Company as part of a program to attract skilled labor. It employed 2 doctors, 4 nurses, and Clara, whose authority in matters of childbirth exceeded that of any physician. She had been born in Michoacán, delivered half the adults now living there, and possessed a moral gravity that made her word difficult to dispute. But even Clara could not explain the mark. Dr. Howard Linton examined the infant that afternoon, his hands gentle but his expression increasingly tense. He measured the discoloration with calipers, noted its symmetry, and tested the skin's sensitivity. The baby responded normally to touch. There was no swelling, no fever, no sign of trauma or infection. The mark was purely dermal, a staining of the skin that resembled a healed ligature injury, though no ligature had touched the child. Dr. Linton wrote in his report, "Unexplained circular dermabrasion present at birth. Etiology unknown. Recommend observation." He did not write what he told Clara in private. This isn't possible. Bruises don't form in utero unless there's physical trauma, and there's no mechanism for a bruise to form in this pattern. Sarah Mitchell refused to speak to anyone except Father Ruiz, who arrived that evening with a rosary and a face drawn tight with worry. He had been the priest who heard Daniel Cortez's final confession, the man who had walked him to the gallows and whispered absolution as the hood was placed over his head. Now he stood over a cradle, staring at a mark that should not exist. "Is it true?" Sarah whispered. "Is this his curse?" Father Ruiz did not answer immediately. He was 62 years old, born in Durango and ordained in El Paso, a man who believed in the literal presence of Christ in the Eucharist and the metaphorical nature of most miracles. But he had heard Cortez's last words. He had seen the conviction in the man's eyes, not the conviction of guilt, but of certainty. "I don't know," Father Ruiz said finally, "but I will find out." That night, he returned to the parish records and began searching for every birth in Michoacán since February 28th. There had been 18 live births recorded in the town since the execution. He contacted each family, asking the same question: "Did your child bear any unusual marks at birth?" 17 families confirmed it. 17 children, born across 14 days, every one of them marked with a circular discoloration around the throat. The 18th child, born to a family passing through town on their way to California, showed no mark at all. Only children born to mothers living in Michoacán carried the stain. Father Ruiz compiled his findings into a letter and sent it to the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, requesting guidance and perhaps an investigation into what he carefully termed a medical anomaly of potential spiritual significance. He received a response 3 weeks later, advising him to consult with medical professionals and avoid inflaming superstition among the faithful. The church would not help. But the town could not stop talking. By April, the pattern was undeniable. Every child born in Michoacán after Daniel Cortez's execution bore the mark. It appeared within minutes of birth, vivid and complete, as though painted onto the skin by an invisible hand. Some marks were darker than others, some thicker, but all shared the same circular shape and the same positioning, encircling the throat exactly where a noose would rest. The mothers began to gather in secret, meeting in the basement of Clara Benson's house to compare their children and share their fears. They were young women, most of them, wives of miners who had come to Michoacán for work and stayed because leaving required money they did not have. They spoke in low voices about guilt, about justice, about whether Daniel Cortez had been innocent. "My husband was on that jury," said Margaret Thorne, holding her daughter close. The child was 5 weeks old, her mark already fading to a pale pink line. "He said the evidence was clear, but he's been having nightmares since she was born. He wakes up saying Cortez's name." "They rushed the trial," said another woman, Elizabeth Garza, whose son was the newest of the marked children. 4 days from arrest to conviction. My brother's a lawyer in Albuquerque. He said no capital case should move that fast. They wanted it over. "Because Harwell was white," said a third voice. It belonged to Rosa Delgado, the only Mexican woman in the group, whose twin boys both bore the mark. "They wanted a Mexican to hang for it, and Cortez was convenient." The room fell silent. Clara Benson, standing near the doorway, finally spoke. "If that's true, then what we're seeing isn't a curse. It's a witness." The women stared at her. "Every baby born here is testifying," Clara continued. "They're carrying evidence we refuse to see." One of the mothers began to cry. Outside, in the streets of Michoacán, the men were having a different conversation. It started in the bars and moved to the Union Hall, then to the steps of the courthouse where Sheriff Cole still maintained his office. The talk was not about guilt or innocence, but about control, about what the marks meant for property values, for the town's reputation, for the future of the mine. "People are going to leave," said Thomas Wardell, the company's regional manager. "Who wants to raise kids here if they're all going to be branded like cattle?" "It's a medical condition," said Dr. Linton, who had been summoned to the meeting. "There has to be an environmental cause, something in the water, the air, maybe exposure to chemicals in the mine." "Then why only babies?" someone asked. "Why not the adults?" Dr. Linton had no answer. Sheriff Cole, a man of 56 who had lived in Michoacán his entire life, sat in the corner of the room and said nothing. He had overseen the execution. He had pulled the lever. And now, every time he saw a woman with an infant, he saw the mark and remembered Daniel Cortez's eyes as the hood went over his head. At this point, I need you to do something. Go to the comments right now and write exactly this: "Justice doesn't forget, it marks us." If this story is stirring something in you, if you feel the weight of what these families are carrying, leave that sentence below. Let's see how many of us are watching this truth together. The investigation into Daniel Cortez's conviction began quietly in May of 1952, not by law enforcement, but by Father Ruiz and a young journalist named Peter Milliken. Milliken worked for the Albuquerque Journal and had heard rumors of the marked children through a stringer in Michoacán. He arrived in town with a notebook, a camera, and a conviction that something extraordinary was happening. Father Ruiz showed him the parish records. Milliken interviewed 12 families, photographed 6 of the marked infants, and then did what journalists do. He started asking questions about the trial. The case file was public record. Milliken read it in 2 hours and immediately saw the gaps. There was no physical evidence linking Cortez to the murder weapon. The rock hammer found near the body had been wiped clean. The witnesses who placed Cortez near Shaft 7 had all been white miners who admitted they couldn't tell Mexicans apart, but were pretty sure it was him. The 4th witness, the one who claimed to have seen Cortez holding a bloody hammer, was a man named Leonard Pike, James Harwell's cousin. Milliken found Pike working a shift at the mine. He was 41 years old, lean and weathered, with the cautious eyes of a man who had learned not to say too much. When Milliken asked him to recount what he saw the night of the murder, Pike hesitated. "I told the court what I saw." "Tell me again." Pike looked around the tunnel, checking for supervisors. Then he spoke quietly. "I saw someone with a hammer. It was dark. I assumed it was Cortez because that's who they were looking for." "Did you actually see his face?" Silence. "Mr. Pike, 17 babies have been born with marks around their necks. Marks that look like noose burns. Do you believe in curses?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," Pike said. And then he walked away. Milliken published his first article on May 19, 1952. The headline read, "Michoacán's Marked Children, Medical Mystery or Sign of Injustice." The story was picked up by wire services and reprinted in newspapers across New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Within a week, Michoacán was famous. The attention brought reporters, photographers, and medical researchers from 3 universities. St. Catherine's Hospital was overwhelmed. The families of the marked children were offered money for interviews, for photographs, for permission to examine their babies. Most refused. A few accepted, desperate for any income that might let them leave Michoacán forever. Dr. Leonard Ashford, a pediatric specialist from Stanford, arrived in June with a team of researchers and a hypothesis. The marks were caused by environmental contamination from the copper mine, perhaps heavy metal poisoning that affected fetal development in a highly specific way. He examined 22 marked children, took blood samples, and tested the town's water supply. His findings, published 3 months later in the Journal of Pediatric Medicine, concluded, "No environmental toxin identified. No genetic abnormality detected. Etiology remains unknown." In his private notes, never published, he wrote, "The marks are identical in every case. Medically, this is impossible. If I believed in the supernatural, I would say these children are carrying a message. But the world was not interested in the supernatural. The world wanted science, and when science had no answer, the world moved on to the next strange story. By August, the reporters had left. By September, even Peter Milliken had returned to Albuquerque, though he continued to send letters to Father Ruiz asking for updates. The families remained, and so did the Marks. In October, something changed. A woman named Helen Voss gave birth to a daughter in St. Catherine's Hospital. Helen was 34, a seamstress who had lived in Michoacán for 11 years. Her baby was healthy, full term, and completely unmarked. Clara Benson checked the infant 3 times. There was no discoloration, no rope burn, no sign of the curse that had touched every other child born in the town since February. The baby's throat was smooth and clear. Helen Voss wept with relief. But Clara felt only dread because she knew what made Helen different. Helen had not been in Michoacán the day Daniel Cortez was executed. She had been visiting her sister in Alamogordo and had returned 2 days later. She had not witnessed the execution. She had not been part of the town's collective choice to let an innocent man die. Clara shared this observation with Father Ruiz, who spent the next week cross-referencing birth records with attendance logs, employment records, and interviews. The pattern held. Every woman who gave birth to a marked child had been living in Michoacán on February 28, 1952. Every woman who had been out of town that day gave birth to unmarked children. The curse, if that's what it was not random. It was specific. It was a judgment. Father Ruiz brought his findings to Sheriff Cole in November. The 2 men sat in the sheriff's office, a pot of coffee between them, and spoke for the first time about what everyone had been avoiding: the possibility that Daniel Cortez had been innocent. "If we reopen the case, what changes?" Sheriff Cole asked. "Everything," Father Ruiz said. "If he was innocent, then we killed an innocent man. And these marks are proof that God or history or conscience, whatever you want to call it, will not let us forget." Sheriff Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I pulled the lever. If he was innocent, then I'm a murderer." "We all are," Father Ruiz said. "Everyone who stayed silent, everyone who didn't ask questions, the whole town." That night, Sheriff Cole went home and wrote a letter to the governor of New Mexico requesting that the Cortez case be reviewed. He included photographs of the marked children, testimonies from the families, and a copy of Peter Milliken's article. He mailed it the next morning. The response came 6 weeks later. The governor's office acknowledged receipt of the letter and stated that post-conviction review requires new evidence of procedural error or factual innocence, neither of which has been demonstrated. The case remained closed, but the children continued to be born marked, and the town continued to live under the weight of what it had done. By the end of 1952, 34 children had been born in Michoacán, bearing the mark of Daniel Cortez's execution. The oldest was 9 months old, the youngest born on Christmas Eve. The mark did not fade with time as doctors had hoped. It remained visible, a permanent scar that no ointment or treatment could erase. The town began to fracture. Some families left, selling their homes at a loss and moving to Albuquerque, Phoenix, or farther. Others stayed, bound by work or stubbornness or the belief that running from guilt was worse than living with it. The children grew, and as they grew, they began to understand that they were different, not because of anything they had done, but because of what had been done before they existed. In January of 1953, Clara Benson organized the first meeting of what she called the Mothers of the Marked. It was not a support group in the traditional sense, but a collective inquiry. If the children bore witness to an injustice, then the mothers had a responsibility to correct it. They began their own investigation into the murder of James Harwell, interviewing miners who had worked Shaft 7, reviewing company records, and slowly piecing together a story the trial had ignored. James Harwell had been a brutal foreman. Multiple miners reported that he withheld wages, falsified safety inspections, and threatened Mexican workers with deportation if they complained. In the weeks before his death, he had been involved in a dispute with the union over working conditions in the deeper shafts, where cave-ins were becoming frequent. 3 miners had died in Shaft 7 in the 6 months before Harwell's murder. The company had blamed worker error. The union suspected sabotage, not by the workers, but by the company, cutting costs on support beams and ventilation. One miner, speaking anonymously to the mothers, said, "Harwell knew the shafts were unsafe. He was told to keep them open anyway. When he started feeling guilty, started talking about going to the state inspector, someone shut him up." "Who?" Clara asked. "Someone with more to lose than a Mexican immigrant." The mothers brought their findings to Sheriff Cole in March of 1953. He listened in silence, took notes, and then admitted what he had been suspecting for months. "If Cortez didn't kill Harwell, then someone let him hang to protect the real killer. Or to protect the company," Clara said. Sheriff Cole reopened the investigation quietly, without informing the press or the company. He re-interviewed Leonard Pike, who finally admitted under pressure that he had not actually seen Daniel Cortez's face the night of the murder. He had seen a man in work clothes holding a hammer and had assumed it was Cortez because that's what everyone was saying. He interviewed the other witnesses. 2 recanted, the 3rd had left town. In April, Sheriff Cole found the piece of evidence that changed everything. A maintenance log from the Michoacán Copper Company showing that James Harwell had filed a formal complaint about structural deficiencies in Shaft 7 2 days before his death. The complaint had been addressed to Thomas Wardle, the regional manager, the same man who had argued most loudly that the marked children were bad for business. Wardle had signed the log, acknowledging receipt of the complaint. Then he had filed it away and done nothing. Sheriff Cole requested an interview with Wardell. The manager refused. 1 week later, Wardell resigned from the company and moved to California. He was never charged with any crime. But his departure was confirmation enough for the town. James Harwell had been killed not by Daniel Cortez, but by someone protecting the company's interests. Someone who knew that a safety investigation would shut down the mine and cost thousands of dollars. Daniel Cortez had been innocent. Father Ruiz held a mass on May 10, 1953, in memory of Daniel Cortez. Nearly the entire town attended, including Sheriff Cole, Clara Benson, and the mothers of the marked, who sat in the front pews holding their children. Father Ruiz spoke for 40 minutes about justice, guilt, and the possibility of repentance. He did not say that the marks would disappear. He said only that the truth had finally been spoken. That night, Sarah Mitchell put her son to bed and noticed something she had not seen before. The mark around his throat had faded. Not completely, but noticeably. Where it had been a vivid crimson, it was now a pale pink. By morning, it was barely visible. Within a week, every marked child in Michoacán showed the same change. The marks were fading. By the end of May, they were gone. The disappearance of the marks was not instantaneous, nor was it uniform. Some children's scars vanished within days, others took weeks. But by June of 1953, every child born in Michoacán since the execution of Daniel Cortez was unmarked, their skin smooth and clear as though the curse had never existed. Medical professionals had no explanation. Dr. Ashford returned to Michoacán and examined 12 of the children, documenting the disappearance with photographs and dermal scans. His report, published in September, stated, "The resolution of the markings coincides with no known medical intervention. The phenomenon remains unexplained." But the families knew. The marks had not faded because of medicine. They had faded because the truth had been acknowledged. On July 14, 1953, the governor of New Mexico issued a posthumous pardon for Daniel Alvaro Cortez, citing substantial evidence of wrongful conviction. The pardon was largely symbolic. Cortez had been dead for 16 months, but it was the first official recognition that an injustice had occurred. Sheriff Cole attended the press conference and publicly apologized for his role in the execution. Peter Milliken wrote a follow-up article for the Albuquerque Journal titled "The Children Who Testified: How a Town Confronted Its Guilt." It was reprinted in national outlets and became one of the most widely read pieces of journalism in 1953. Milliken interviewed Clara Benson, Father Ruiz, and several of the mothers of the marked, giving voice to the people who had fought for the truth. But he also interviewed Sheriff Cole, who said, "I pulled the lever that killed Daniel Cortez. I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But what happened here, what those children showed us, is that guilt has a weight, and that weight doesn't disappear until you face it. The town of Michoacán did not return to normal. How could it? 34 families had lived for over a year with children who bore the physical evidence of an injustice, a reminder that could not be ignored or explained away. That experience changed them. It changed the town. In August, the Michoacán Copper Company implemented new safety protocols for all mining operations, including mandatory inspections and worker representation on safety committees. The union, emboldened by the attention the case had brought, negotiated better wages and conditions. Shaft 7 was permanently closed. Thomas Wardell was never prosecuted. He lived in Los Angeles until his death in 1971, working in real estate and never speaking publicly about Michoacán. According to his obituary, he left no children. Daniel Cortez's grave in Michoacán Cemetery became a site of quiet pilgrimage. Families left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes of apology. In 1955, the town commissioned a new headstone, a granite marker that read, Daniel Alvaro Cortez, 1921-1952. Innocent, forgiven, remembered. Father Ruiz remained the parish priest in Michoacán until his retirement in 1974. In his later years, he often spoke about the marked children in homilies, describing them not as victims of a curse, but as instruments of grace, small prophets who had spoken a truth the adults could not. Clara Benson continued her work as a midwife until 1968. She delivered over 200 more children in Michoacán, none of whom bore any mark. In interviews, she always said the same thing. Those children taught us that history doesn't end when we want it to. It continues in flesh and blood until we make it right. The children themselves grew up as ordinary as any children could be, given what they had carried. Some stayed in Michoacán, others left. A few became activists, drawn to work in justice and civil rights. One, a boy named Michael Thorne, became a lawyer and spent his career defending wrongly convicted prisoners. When asked why, he said, "I was born with a reminder that innocence is fragile. I never forgot." In 1982, a doctoral student in anthropology from the University of New Mexico wrote her dissertation on the Michoacán case, analyzing it through the lens of collective trauma and social memory. She interviewed 26 of the marked children, now adults in their 30s. Most remembered nothing of their infancy, but all knew the story. They carried it not on their skin, but in their identity. One woman interviewed for the dissertation said, "We were proof. That's what my mother always told me. We were proof that the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's painful. I don't remember the mark, but I remember what it meant." The case has been studied by medical researchers, psychologists, theologians, and historians. No consensus has ever been reached on what caused the marks. Some call it mass hysteria, a psychosomatic response to collective guilt. Others suggest environmental factors that were never identified. A few, mostly those who lived through it, believe it was something beyond science, an intervention by forces that demand accountability. What is not disputed is this. For 14 months, every child born in Michoacán, New Mexico, carried a visible scar that looked exactly like a noose burn. The scars appeared only on children whose mothers had been present in the town on the day Daniel Cortez was executed. The scars faded only after the truth of his innocence was publicly acknowledged. The town still exists. Its population has declined to less than 1,500, and the mine closed in 1989. But the cemetery remains, and so does the grave of Daniel Cortez. Visitors still come, not many, but enough. They leave flowers. They take photographs. They stand in silence, thinking about justice, about guilt, about the strange ways history inscribes itself on the innocent. Was Daniel Cortez's final statement a curse, a prophecy, or simply the last cry of a man who knew he was about to die for a crime he did not commit? Was the appearance of the marks a supernatural event, a medical anomaly, or a collective psychological manifestation of communal guilt? The answer depends on what you believe about the world, whether it is governed only by material laws, or whether there are forces, moral or spiritual, that intervene when injustice becomes unbearable. What is certain is that 34 children were born bearing witness to something their community tried to ignore. And in the end, the community could not ignore them. The Marks forced a reckoning. They forced the truth. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the weight of truth and the cost of silence, hit the like button and share this video. These are the stories history tries to bury, and we keep them alive by remembering together. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next revelation.